Hello and welcome. You're listening to Exposed Abortion in America, where we uncover the truth of the abortion industry. I'm your host, Eva Cooley, and in today's episode, we welcome Lois Miller, Senior Legal Communications Officer with Alliance Defending Freedom International, and her husband, Dr. Callum Miller, UK medical doctor and pro-life advocate. Mrs. Miller discusses the two shocking stories of abortion center buffer zones in the UK. Adam Smith Connor, who was convicted for praying silently outside an abortion center, and Livia Tossici-Bolt, who was convicted for offering to speak to people only if they wanted, outside of an abortion center. Dr. Miller addresses challenges like the abortion drug and emotional tactics used by pro-abortion advocates in the UK and beyond. He notes how the public is largely unaware of the profit motives of the abortion lobby in the UK, similar to Planned Parenthood in the US. As a final charge, he urges the US to hold fast to her freedom of speech, as it is crucial in sustaining the pro-life movement. So today on our podcast, we have Lois Miller. Lois serves as a Senior Legal Communications Officer with the Alliance Defending Freedom. She works with journalists and press representatives to advocate for fundamental freedoms in the court of public opinion, both in written pieces and through public speaking. Before beginning her current role, Lois was a legal analyst on ADF International's UN advocacy team at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and there she provided member state representatives with key legal resources and a mandatory language which promotes the inherent value of every person. Lois is a champion and defender of the pro-life movement, and we are delighted to have her on our podcast today. So Lois, welcome. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and why you do it?
Oh, well, thank you for this very kind introduction for having me on this podcast. I have for a long time had the privilege of working with ADF International in its global mission around the world and now specifically in the UK. And we defend the right of everybody to live and speak the truth. I think as a Scottish person, as someone who's lived in Britain growing up, I can see the censorship unfolding for people who are speaking important messages about life, about protecting kids from certain ideologies. And these are some of the most important things, that we can talk about in our society today. Our organization has lawyers working around the world. So we do hear reports from, Nigeria and Pakistan about Christians on death row, just for expressing their faith on a WhatsApp message. And of course, Europe's not quite there. We're definitely not killing anyone because of their faith. But the kind of laws that come in, these hate speech laws, these censorship laws, which shut down debate and shut down opinion, they are kind of cut from the same cloth as blasphemy laws, certainly not as extreme, but still saying that those who speak out against the dominant ideas of the day, the dominant opinions of the day, the government's view of the day should be silenced. So yeah, I think it's really important to push back on that, and I'm really privileged to get to do that with ADF International.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for just being such a strong mover in this movement. You have such a powerful voice and your work is so important. So thank you for giving us that background. Can you
Yeah.
tell us more about why you're pro-life or how you got interested in the pro-life movement?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up with particularly strong pro-life leanings. I would have chosen to be pro-life if I'd really been pushed, but it wasn't something we really talked about in our church very much or anything like that. I actually became particularly interested in it when I was at university level because I was looking at the issue of surrogacy. And as I went on to do my LLM degree in law, I chose to focus on surrogacy, which was a kind of emerging bioethical issue of the day, and what it meant for human rights. And as I got more into it, I started defending the human rights of the baby involved, because obviously nobody should be sold to be someone's child, but that's what happens through surrogacy. And as I was developing that argument, it just became more and more obvious. Like, if I'm defending someone's right not to be sold before they're born, why am I not defending the right to simply live before they're born? Surely that is as fundamental as anything else. And yeah, my husband Callum was a particularly strong voice in the pro-life movement. So as I got to know him, I became very acquainted with the arguments for protecting life in the woman. And here we are today.
Wow, well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd love to talk more about your work right now. So can you tell me about the story of Adam Smith Connor?
Of course, yes. Well, you might think that seeing somebody arrested for their thoughts is something you'd only read about in Orwell's 1984, but no, in fact, in 2024 and the years surrounding, I've been working with the ADF International team in defending Adam Smith Connor, who was arrested just for the prayers that he had in his head. Adam is an army veteran for our country. He served in Afghanistan, and 20 years ago, he paid for an abortion with his girlfriend at the time. He later in life became a Christian. It wasn't something that particularly occurred to him until a few years ago. He became particularly convicted about what he had done and the child that was now missing from his life. Quite often, we hear these stories of grief many years after an abortion, coming to terms with the life that is missing, with the child that is missing. This happened to Adam. It moved him very deeply, and he turned to prayer. And he's been praying about this issue, about what happened to him and what he had done, but also about men and women every day who are facing the same difficult decisions, that they would feel comforted and encouraged to choose life and to choose parenthood. Adam stopped to pray in 2022, November 2022, about this issue that was on his heart near an abortion facility. He stood across the road in a public green. He was kind of obscured by a tree anyway. Nobody would really have known if they were passing by what he was doing. They think he was waiting for a friend or maybe waiting for a taxi or just having a moment of quiet reflection in a park. But officers approached him. They asked what he was doing. He said he was praying. They asked him the nature of his prayer. He said, "Well, I'm praying about my son." And as the conversation progressed, the officers decided that this was a criminal offence because he was stationed near an abortion facility, and went on to prosecute him. This legal battle has gone on several years already, but in October 2024, he was convicted of this thought crime. He's the first man in modern British history, perhaps even modern European history, Western history, that has ever been convicted for a silent thought that he held in his head.
That is a shocking, shocking testimony. What type of implication does this story have for the rest of the pro-life movement and even just free speech in general in the UK if silent prayers can be criminalized?
Yeah, this is really the thin end of the wedge for censorship because in the UK, we have a very strong free speech movement that is very keen to defend important rights, speaking about men being men and women being women on those kinds of issues. But there are fewer people who are willing to defend free speech on the issue of abortion because it's a particularly unpopular topic, especially in the UK. But because of that unpopularity, it's become the victim of the most censorship. So we've introduced these buffer zone laws around abortion facilities that prohibit expressing approval or disapproval about abortion. And of course, the extremity of seeing somebody prosecuted just for what's in their head has never ever been seen before. But unfortunately, I think for a while people were keen to push it under the radar. So it's just because this abortion distortion is it's a tricky topic to speak about, and a lot of people don't want to kind of defend somebody who was thinking or speaking about that. But we have seen a growing resistance, though, as IDF International have taken 3 or 4 cases forward now through the courts to defend people who have been the victims of censorship. We do see a growing resistance and a growing number of people waking up and saying, hang on, I might agree with Adam and these other individuals, or I might disagree, but what I can say is that it's wrong to arrest someone just for their thoughts or just, for offering a conversation, standing peacefully on a street. That's not a crime, particularly right now, as we see, shoplifting is at an all-time high in London. There's plenty of crimes for the police to be dealing with, which they are not able to deal with. Why are we spending all these resources just simply on, peaceful thoughts and peaceful prayers?
You mentioned buffer zones. Can you explain that for our listeners who might not know what buffer zones are? And then can you tell us how that has impacted the UK culturally?
Yeah, sure. So buffer zones were introduced initially by 5 local authority areas in England, who claimed that women were being harassed outside of abortion facilities. Now, the situation in the UK is actually very different to America. This is a much less political, heated debate in the UK, and there was actually very, very little evidence to show that there was any wrongdoing outside of clinics. And in fact, the law would have already prosecuted anyone who had been aggressive or violent in any case. A government review said that any such incidents were very rare, and the most common activities outside an abortion facility was offering a leaflet or simply standing praying. Both obviously legal, even helpful activities to women who are in a crisis pregnancy situation. Nevertheless, the local councils somewhat ideologically took these zones forward and implemented them, banning anyone from expressing approval or disapproval near an abortion facility. Many of these local laws actually name prayer or different religious activity, so it is quite an anti-Christian, anti-religious zone. As a result, we began to see people being prosecuted for these helpful activities. Even though women spoke out, there was a campaign group called Be Here For Me of women who had been through crisis pregnancies and had been helped by pro-life volunteers and said, look, women have the right to, if women have the right to choose, surely they have the right to choose to speak to a volunteer who's available to chat to them about resources available should they wish to continue their pregnancies. Many women said that they had been comforted and helped and offered the support that they wanted from these pro-life charities. But now that resource and opportunity was being taken away from them. So instead of being pro-choice, this is actually no choice. It was saying abortion or nothing. Despite this, these laws continued, people were prosecuted, and in 2024, the UK government passed, under a Conservative government, passed legislation to roll out these zones not only in the 5 local areas, but across the country. So now any abortion facility in England, there will be a zone of 200 meters where you may not influence anyone's decision or a decision to access the clinic. So influence is obviously, for lawyers who are listening, a very, very broad word. What is influence? Some people would say, oh, well, what it really means is someone shouting in your face, and obviously no one supports that. But actually, influence can also mean, we influence each other all the time as we're speaking. I might say an idea that you might think is interesting, or you might disagree with. That's a form of influence. Influence can be chatting, influence can be apparently seeing somebody praying might influence someone's decision. Who knew prayer could be so powerful? And so this very broad law is being used to prosecute Christians for peaceful and lawful activities.
Wow. I would love if you could talk to us about another example of someone
Yeah.
who has committed the crime of quote unquote influence, and that's the story of Dr. Livia Tossici-Bolt. Could you tell us what her story has been?
Yeah, absolutely. So Livia has for many years been a volunteer for women in crisis pregnancies. It's something that she's been felt called to do since the kind of COVID era. And as she was participating in these kind of volunteer groups, she got to know people in the local community as they would walk past. She became quite popular in the local area. She had friends who knew her, who would stop to chat, and she really felt that she was, living out a calling, enjoying her work as a volunteer. Now, as the buffer zones came in her local area, she respected the law, even though she disagreed with it. And she and her volunteers moved outside the buffer zone to do any sort of engagement, any sort of leaflets, handing about services available to women in crisis pregnancies. But she personally missed being in that local area. She'd made friends over the years. She knew the place. She loved the place. And she thought, well, what I'll do is I'm not going to go in and talk about, or, specifically, do my pro-life advocacy, but what I can do is I can just have conversations with people. I can chat to people. She'd seen this trend of people offering free hugs. So, after COVID, people were going out and having these kind of street conversations. So she thought she'd get involved as well. So she went out with her sign, which said, "Here to talk if you want." And she just made herself available in that green public space across the road from her local abortion clinic. And people did stop to chat to her. Students came by and they kind of thought she was quite cute and had conversations about what they were studying. Some parents walked by, talked about what's going on with their kids, etc. And then police came by and confronted her about what she was doing. And that Confrontation eventually led to Livia being prosecuted for offering these conversations near an abortion facility. And unfortunately, she was convicted last month for engaging in engaging in such activities near an abortion facility, even though she was doing, having perfectly peaceful conversations about all sorts of manner of things. This was not deemed enough to prove her innocence. We will be appealing Livia's case and Adam's case but Adam's case will be up for appeal in July, and Livia's, we haven't quite got a date yet, but we will hear about that soon. And so we wait to hear how this will progress as we go up the court system. Disappointing result to start off with down there in Bournemouth, but these cases are gaining global attention, and I think everybody around the world is seeing how unjust these rulings have been, how unjust these prosecutions have been, and hopefully that too can help shine a light on the issue and get recognition for this human rights abuse, which can hopefully go towards amending it.
The thing that really strikes me about Livia's case is she uses the words here to talk if you want. So
Right.
there is no element of her forcing her opinion on anyone. She is just opening the door. I'm here for you if you would like to just talk to me. The fact that that can be criminalized does feel very 1984. So thank you and your team for working so hard to fight for truth and fight for that freedom of speech. I found this quote from the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, which is the UK's leading abortion quote unquote charity. And they said that the verdict will protect women and the staff who provide abortion care. What is your reaction to this quote?
I've heard the voices of women from Be Here For Me who have talked about how useful and helpful it was to have volunteers out there offering support, offering, this is like financial support, emotional support, housing, baby clothes, incredible work that pro-life charities do. I know what has really been offered outside those clinics, and I know um how right and good that is. And it is shocking that anyone would want to see that diminished, particularly in England, but also my country, in Scotland, we've brought in these rules as well. They're even more severe, even going as far as to influence how people should behave inside their homes if they live near a hospital where abortion is provided. So I think anyone can see when they look into the stats, when they look into what's actually happening in the UK, it's very clear that while we all stand against harassment and abuse, which is already illegal, there is no sense, there is no use in blocking volunteers from doing the good work that they've been carrying out for a long time.
Well, thank you for all this background about these cases and about the buffer zones in the UK. I think it would be really helpful for our listeners to just hear from you about what the pro-life movement looks like in the UK. I think a lot of our listeners have a good grasp of what the pro-life movement looks like in the US, but not so much the UK. So could you just tell us how you would characterize the pro-life movement in the UK?
Sure. Well, we're facing some severe challenges in the UK. We have one of the most liberal abortion laws in Europe. Most European countries allow abortion for most reasons up to 12 or 15 weeks. We allow up to 24 weeks or 6 months and thereabouts. And in certain circumstances, such as if your child has a disability, you can have abortion all the way up to birth. So for a long time, we've been carrying this very heavy abortion law, and now we're under a Labour left-wing government. Two MPs within the last week have said that they want to put forward measures to allow abortion up to birth for any reason, to decriminalise it all through 9 months of pregnancy. It's also, of course, this is very discouraging for a pro-life movement, which is fairly underfunded and underrepresented in the UK. We don't have the same kind of access to resources as many pro-life movements do in the States. But with every debate that comes up, with every challenge that's in our way, is a chance to be making the case in the press, in the public, for life. And we also know that every person who hears about the news of what what a child really is, what abortion really is, and how making that case for how we can create a society which does much better for women, that believes women deserve better than abortion, which believes babies have that right to have a life. Every person that hears this has that opportunity to make a different choice and to influence their friends to do that as well. So, whilst we're realistic about the battles ahead, we hope we can use them for a good purpose.
That's really helpful. And I know here in the US, especially at SBA, we talk a lot about Planned Parenthood and the abortion lobby and the way that the abortion lobby just wages war on women, babies, and the pro-life movement. Can you tell me about the abortion lobby in the UK? How does it look similarly to that in the US? And just how does it wage war on the pro-life movement where you're at?
Yeah, I think they have a good degree of political influence. And so, and a good degree of media influence as well. And that's being the case. We legalized abortion before the USA had Roe v. Wade. We legalized in 67. So that's 57 years of influence that the abortion lobby has had, and they are particularly powerful. But when you expose the data and you expose the science, and thankfully more and more research is coming to light about when babies feel pain in the womb and when viability is possible, and all these arguments that resonate with people who aren't quite sure about what they think yet. These arguments are true and they're helpful, and even a powerful abortion lobby can't really stand against them. So we can make dents, but we are realistic about the influence that this monolith has had for a very long time, and we just hope to chip away with the truth and make that case to the public.
Now, I think someone listening to this episode from the UK could be at times discouraged about the future of the pro-life movement in the UK. Do you think there is cause for hope? Do you see signs of hearts being changed and minds being influenced by the pro-life movement in the UK?
I think one helpful thing to remember is that although the media seem to indicate that Britain is particularly pro-abortion, polling shows that less than 1% of women actually support abortion all the way up to birth for any reason. So people might call themselves pro-choice, but nobody's pro that much choice. At least very, very few people would say a woman should have the choice to kill her 1-year-old. So we're not really all pro-choice. We all have our limits. And 70% of women, according to polling from 2017, would like to see the abortion limit lowered. We're currently at 24 weeks, like I said, one of the most liberal in Europe. And when people are presented with the information about the fact that this is long past viability now and long past the point where babies can likely feel pain, most women would like to see that lowered. And so I think when we look at the actual opinion polling and the actual data, we do have cause for hope. But again, it's breaking through that challenging environment that we have, where that influence has been so strong to get these statistics out and to get these facts known. But yeah, last year we had a similar decriminalization attempt from MPs. It was saved by the bell in that an election was called just a week before, and that bill was due to go through Parliament, and so the process never took off. But we were able to see in the weeks leading up to that prospect being debated of decriminalization up to birth that people were interested in nuance and. When pushed about their views, although they had initially thought they might support such a move, when they looked at what it really was, they changed their mind. So I think we do have some cause for hope.
And just as we conclude here, what would your word of encouragement or your charge be to the pro-life movement in the US or the UK?
Oh. I think it's really important to support each other around the world. I mean, in every country there is a pro-life movement. Well, in every country there is pro-life people, let's say. And we all face different circumstances. In the developing world, it's very different. There's a hugely pro-life culture that's impacted negatively by funding that comes across from the US, the UK, and the UN, and all these places. And so they have their own challenges. And the US, obviously, you have a very fiery debate that presents its own opportunities, but also it can make it a difficult environment to be working in. And in Europe, we're just kind of trying to wake people up to from this slumber they've been in for 50 years, where they think that abortion is fine and that it's not harmfully impacting our population, both women, men, and children. And so we all have different challenges, but it's important to be cognizant of these different challenges and keep in mind how we can support each other. Whether that's getting some press out in different countries to expose a light on what's happening in Europe or in different places, or funding, or just giving that word of encouragement or support when you see, votes or bills or challenges coming up in other countries. I think that can be really useful and really helpful. I'd love to see more coordination across the globe as we advance this cause for life together.
Wow. Well, Lois, thank you so much for taking the time to join our podcast today. Our listeners are going to benefit so much from the words that you offered to us, just offering so much insight into those stories of Adam and Livia, and for us to get to understand where the UK is coming from with the pro-life movement. So thank you so much for joining, and we so much appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
So today on our podcast, we welcome Dr. Callum Miller. Dr. Miller is a medical doctor in the UK and has published over 30 academic papers in law, medicine, philosophy, and ethics. He gives international academic presentations. He participates in debates, including debating the CEO of the UK's largest abortion provider. And Dr. Miller is also working on 3 books on the topic of abortion. Dr. Miller, I am so delighted to have you on our podcast today. Thank you so much for being here. So to begin, could you just give our listeners a brief introduction about who you are and how you relate to the pro-life discussion?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on and for introducing me. So I became pro-life at medical school. In my country, only 5% of people are pro-life. So I was one of the 95% majority for a long time. And then I decided to make myself very unpopular, throw away some of my career prospects by becoming pro-life. That was in the middle of medical school. I still do quite a bit of research at the university. I do a lot of speaking internationally. I do a lot of advocacy work in many different countries, as well as the very secular countries of Europe that are very pro-choice. So that's me. I love speaking about this topic. Love opening people's sort of awareness of the international dynamic to this in Europe, but also far, far beyond. And so, yeah, delighted to be here today.
Could you tell me more about why you are pro-life, especially considering just how unpopular it is in your country?
Yeah, for me, it was really thinking about human rights from an equality perspective. It wasn't so much thinking about sanctity of life or anything like that. It was really just fundamentally about equality. I grew up in a very kind of left-leaning environment, as pretty much everyone in the UK does. And I was very concerned about the marginalized, the vulnerable, and so on. I guess it struck me that, if the unborn child is a human being and if all human beings are equal, then the unborn child has the same value as any one of us, and obviously as one of the most marginalized, vulnerable people there is. And so, a lot of people on the left are are very much pro-abortion, and that's connected to a lot of their other political ideology. But for me, it was very much, I had a deep concern for people on the margins. And once I was convinced of the scientific evidence that the biology clearly shows that life begins at conception, then it was a simple implication of my belief in human rights and human equality that I had to accept the unborn child as an equal human being, and therefore had to advocate for them as well. So yeah, it came with some challenges, but it also came with some profound joys and encouragement as well.
And on that note of those challenges, can you just talk briefly about how having a pro-life perspective, particularly within the academia field, and within the medical field, how has that impacted your career?
It's difficult to say exactly because, people when people discriminate, sometimes they're very stupid and do it very openly and explicitly and get sued. In other cases, they're much more sensible and they sort of do it behind the scenes. They never tell you, we didn't consider you for this reason, but it clearly happens. So it's only a few cases where it's been really noticeable. Um, One is, I had a whistleblower privately from one of the top medical journals write to me, and we had a phone conversation as well. And they basically said, look, our editor won't publish anything you write on any topic, no matter how good or well evidenced it is or anything like that. You're just persona non grata in that sense. So that obviously has been a huge challenge, negotiating the academic sphere in journals and that sort of thing. I didn't even try to get a full-time job in academia because the chances were so slim of getting a full-time paid position. So, I see it a lot, I suppose, when I do peer review work and I submit journals to articles and that sort of thing because if you submit a very well researched article that is clearly very rigorous, isn't particular, isn't really controversial even, but sort of is in any way critical or could be interpreted as critical of abortion, it is very, very difficult to get it published anywhere. And when you get the feedback from the journal, it often just doesn't even make sense. Like I'm pretty sure in some cases they haven't even read it when they've given their comments. Whereas by contrast, I've been a peer reviewer for many of the leading sexual and reproductive health journals on the topic of abortion. And the papers that get submitted are absolutely horrendous quality in some cases. And yet I read what the other reviewers have said, and they just wave it through just because it's supportive of abortion, even with glaring errors. And so, yeah, I think we see very clearly a double standard when it comes to publishing. And so, publishing or being hired for a position or whatever it might be, you can clearly see the difference in treatment. I would say in the UK that we actually enacted specific academic freedom legislation a couple of years ago because even in this very progressive sort of dominated country, there was sufficient recognition that academia is totally biased and really not objective any longer. So that there was actually a bill that was passed in Parliament to preserve academic freedom. So there are some positive developments, but I would say that the field is still pretty difficult for someone who's pro-life.
Well, I just want to say thank you for standing for pro-life. Thank you on behalf of the pro-life movement here in the US, and just thank you on behalf of SBA Pro-Life because we just are so appreciative of what you are doing and the fact that you're speaking out despite what it often does mean for your career. So I'd love for you to talk more about some of the international policies regarding abortion, more of your expertise. Could you walk our listeners through some of what other nations have done to restrict abortion, what has worked, what hasn't worked?
Yeah, so most of the world's countries are still pro-life, and when I say that, I guess I mean that they prohibit the large majority of abortions, all except a few rare cases. Some countries go all the way and say unless a woman's life is at risk, abortion is prohibited. Many of them allow it in slightly more circumstances, but the large majority, about 120 of the countries, are generally pro-life. They say abortion only in very limited circumstances. And so, in that sense, most of the world is on our side. And when we're portrayed as these kind of, fringe radical extremists in America or in Europe, I think it's quite easy to point to the rest of the world and say, look, the rest of the world just doesn't agree with you. And we're actually in the global majority and the historical majority for the last 2000 years or so. Um, and this came up in the Supreme Court. So when Roe v. Wade was overturned in Dobbs v. Jackson, one of the most important arguments that was made was that and this was, I think, cited by the court as being the first justification, the primary justification that Mississippi gave for their restriction on abortion that led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. They said the US is one of only a handful of countries around the world that allows abortion beyond the point of viability, or elective abortion beyond the point of viability. And so the court recognized, and a huge segment of the public recognized, that the US And even now, many states like New York and California and the typical blue states, they're still totally extreme when it comes to the global picture, up there with countries like China or in the past North Korea and others. And so, yeah, I would say that the large majority of the world is pro-life. One of the difficulties is enforcement. So enforcement in a lot of the world is challenging. The law is very clear, but it's very easy to obtain abortions in a lot of countries. And so I would say that most countries still have a lot of work to do in terms of making sure that the law is upheld, especially in this new era of chemical abortion. But nevertheless, in terms of preserving that pro-life culture and those laws for many years, they've managed to do that until very recently, where we're seeing a pretty rapid shift of sentiment among young people that is causing a lot of concern. And it's something that I think we need to wake up to in the West, because I think we could wake up in 10 years and find that those 120 countries have all flipped, and we've lost a huge opportunity to save millions of lives and keep the global majority on our side. My real worry is that that can happen in the next 10 years. And so, yeah, I think we have a big job, those of us who are experienced in this issue and have seen how abortion has wrecked our own countries. I think we have a real responsibility to those other countries to warn them of what's ahead and prepare them so that they don't make that same mistake. And I think when we do that, we genuinely can save millions of lives.
That's a really helpful perspective because I think a lot of US citizens don't know, they don't understand that the US is very extreme when it comes to abortion. When you look at so many other nations, they are much more pro-life. So thank you so much for shedding light on that for our listeners. And I'd love for you to talk to us more about how specifically the UK has dealt with abortion and for what reasons are abortions allowed in the UK.
Yeah, so the UK legalized abortion in 1967, so just a few years before US states started to do so, and then Roe v. Wade. Um, at the time, what it's a little bit complex, the legal history. We have a long legal history on this question. In the sort of early 20th century, there was a court judgment that slightly opened up the door to abortion. It basically said, look, we've always recognized in common law and in precedent that if a woman's life is at risk, then she can have an abortion. Um, so in the early 20th century, one of the courts said, well, preserving the life isn't just about literally saving the life, it also means preventing the mother from becoming a physical or mental wreck. And so there was a case with a 14-year-old girl who was the victim of rape, who the doctor performed an abortion and defended himself and said the life-saving sort of provision in common law, and even if not in statute, allows me to do this. And the court upheld that. Incidentally, that doctor then went on to found what we think is the oldest pro-life organization in the world. So he changed his mind totally and began to be an advocate for the unborn, just as um, Jane Roe from the Roe v. Wade case did. Um, all that to say, that opened the door a little bit so that they began accepting abortion sort of for some severe mental health reasons and that sort of thing. And then over the 1960s, that just built and built so much that they said, okay, we need to legislate for this. And at the time, they kind of just thought they were legislating to codify what had already become the practice. But what we saw is that by putting it into the law, by saying explicitly a woman can have an abortion for mental health reasons, it basically opened the door to abortion on demand. So within 10 years, you had hundreds of thousands of abortions every year. Um, and so it was a very quick, rapid increase in abortion beyond that point. And so to this day, the law has changed a tiny bit in 1990, but effectively the law says up until 24 weeks, so a couple of weeks beyond viability, 6 months of pregnancy, you can have an abortion for mental health reasons, which in practice means absolutely anything. Even if the baby's a girl and you wanted a baby boy, you can have an abortion for mental health reasons. And then if the baby is disabled, the abortion is allowed up to birth. And so we see quite a few very, very late term abortions in the UK as well. So, in that sense, it's a very similar picture to what we saw in most of the US, where abortion is allowed pretty much any reason up to viability. And then after that, in cases of disability and various other situations. The problem is in the US, you had a really strong pushback, which has led to a lot of progress over these 50 years, whereas in the UK, sadly, things have just been getting worse and worse, where we're now at the point of arresting people for praying silently in their heads, 100 meters away from an abortion clinic. So I'm sure many people heard about that in the US, and it's become an issue of huge concern where, we're getting to the point we're not even allowed to advocate for being pro-life anymore. Or even not even advocate, but we're not even allowed to pray silently in our heads in certain places anymore. So, yeah, it's become a big challenge, and one that we're still facing to this day.
Wow. And I would just be curious, can you tell our listeners what the pro-life movement looks like in the UK? Because you're mentioning how so many of your freedoms have been taken away with in regards to, your prayer life and the pro-life beliefs that you have. So what does the movement look like over there?
I would say it's had renewed energy in recent years. So even though we're kind of a fairly small proportion of the population, um, they've been able to be pretty effective in blocking certain things in the parliament. So whenever they've tried to make things worse in the parliament, I think in most cases we've been able to block it, and that's because, to a large degree, the things that they're pushing for are so extreme that the majority of the public is on our side. But nevertheless, I think it's still a big achievement that the pro-life movement has been able to rally that wider group and actually make a difference, given just how much the parliament and the media are against us. I would say that although, yeah, for sure, over the last 50 years, public opinion has just got progressively worse. The law has got progressively worse. I would say that in really recent times, and we're talking really just the last 2 or 3 years, I think there's some evidence that things are improving. So there have been a few polls showing that the youngest generation is the most pro-life. And I'm the kind of person that's skeptical of that. So when the first one came out, I just said I don't believe it and dismissed it. I thought it must be wrong. But it's pretty consistent now that the young generation is actually, they're not majority pro-life, but they are more pro-life than the older generations. And that gives us cause for hope that things could change. At the same time, we in the US, I know things have changed a bit recently, but for the last maybe 30 years, if you're a Republican in any state other than the really blue states, you kind of had to at least say you were pro-life, even if you didn't really back it up with what you did. You at least had to say the right things. In the UK, if you're a Conservative Party politician that wants any sort of cabinet position or really significant political career, you pretty much have to be pro-choice. So even our Conservative Party is pretty strongly pro-choice. And so all that to say, we've been fighting a battle where both ends of the political spectrum are pro-choice. And so it's really sort of little to work with. But over the last couple of years, I genuinely think that in conservative circles, in the younger generation, this is becoming an issue again. And we're seeing that secular conservative people who always in the past would have been pro choice, we're seeing pretty secular conservative people in Gen Z saying, actually, yeah, this is really wrong. This is a bad thing. We need to do something about this. And it's becoming a topic of conversation in conservative circles again, which it just hasn't been for decades. And so that's obviously a very low point to start from. And it's sort of, it can feel like clutching at straws, but I don't think it is. I think any movement has to start somewhere. And if we're making progress in a certain sector of society, and it's the society that we need, the sector that we need to begin with, then I think it offers hope for the future that this could become a wider movement in future. So I'm not totally pessimistic. I think there's cause for hope even in a place like this.
Well, that is a very encouraging answer that perhaps the next generation is one that can be the pro-life generation that can be the leading charge in making our world more of a pro-life world once again. So I have another question for you about, I guess, the influence of the abortion lobby in the UK, because in the US we have Planned Parenthood, and we can talk about that a little bit later if we have time. But does the UK have an equivalent to Planned Parenthood, or is Planned Parenthood also the largest abortion giant in the UK as well?
Yeah, we have a slightly strange situation in that we actually are the headquarters of International Planned Parenthood Federation. So they're based in London, but yet domestically they're actually fairly non-existent as far as I can tell. So their international operations are based here, but in the UK there's not much from them. They're not one of the main abortion providers, unless one of them has a connection that I'm unaware of. We do have a kind of equivalent. We have two that are, I think, by quite some way the biggest kind of franchises. So one is BPAS, the British Pregnancy Advisory Service. The other is Marie Stopes International, which is a big organization in about 40 countries, and they have a lot of clinics in the UK as well. Um, they're quite different in terms of their reputation, I would say. I mean, both of them are taken for granted by politicians and the media and so on. But when you look at sort of hospital regulators reports, kind of inspections that have been done of those clinics, BPAS has some problems and they're pretty significant, and it's certainly not sort of plain sailing for them. But by contrast, when you look at Marie Stopes, a significant number of their regulator reports are absolutely horrifying in terms of the safety to women, in terms of confidentiality, in terms of consent practices and things like that. And so that's the one that is much more global. So those are sort of the two main players in the UK. Obviously, Planned Parenthood, has its operations here internationally, and so I'm sure there's a big connection with the US. But yeah, we don't quite have the same dynamic of having this big sort of supervillain Planned Parenthood that that we can quite rally around here.
That's really helpful. And I love I love thinking about Planned Parenthood as being the supervillain because that is definitely the case here in the US. I'm wondering what tactics does the abortion lobby use in the UK and elsewhere to increase, quote unquote, their business and their revenue? Can you speak on that?
Yeah, I don't know for certain. I couldn't say too much for certain about their business model. Going back to those regulator reports that I mentioned, though, we do know that Marie Stopes at least used to, and maybe still does, have a policy where if a woman went home without having an abortion and changed her mind, they would actually call her up again to see if she might reconsider. Likewise, we know that their consent practices were pretty sketchy. Children were routinely given abortions without proper valid consent being taken. And there was actually a really revealing line in one of those reports where it said that staff were talking about the corporate focus on key performance indicators, one of which was whether the woman had abortions. And the line from one of these reports was so striking because these were not people who left the abortion industry. They certainly weren't pro-life advocates. These were people who were working for the abortion provider. And it said that the staff felt that this corporate focus on key performance indicators worked against the concept of patient choice. So they were talking about their current organization, Marie Stopes, and saying that Marie Stopes was so focused on their corporate indicators that it explicitly worked against the concept of patient choice, which was just so striking given that this is the narrative which justifies their existence in the first place. So those are just a couple of the things that we've seen where they've really been trying to expand just how much profit they make, how many abortions they provide, and we see, how much they're paid with their bonus. For their CEO. I think their CEO was paid $500,000 a couple of years ago, just as a bonus on top of their salary. These people really, you can see the profit motives. You can see how much they're paid, and that making money is still very much a significant part of their practice in the UK.
Wow, those are all very shocking facts and definitely sound similar to the way Planned Parenthood operates here in the US. In the UK, is there an understanding amongst citizens that abortion is a business and that, they're just trying to get as many abortions done for money, or is it still thought of as a safe, ethical medical procedure?
Yeah, I was stunned to read the other day some opinion polling on Planned Parenthood that showed that it actually had a somewhat high approval rating. Because I to me it's obvious to anyone, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice or whatever, it's obvious that they have a lot of serious failures in terms of safety, in terms of practices with what they do with the baby's parts afterwards, and even their population control agenda globally. There's a huge, huge history of Planned Parenthood being involved with some very sinister practices when it comes to depopulation globally around the world historically, particularly when you look at its connections in China and obviously their one child policy for the last few decades. So I think in the same way, people in the UK, I think they're just so bought in, and I guess it's such an emotional topic that if you're pro-choice, then you sort of have a natural skepticism of pro-lifers. And if there's a company that, has a pretty good corporate face, they have some decent PR, and they superficially are about healthcare and being pro-choice, I think if you are pro-choice, it's just easy to trust them and not really think about what they're actually like. So I think most people just are totally unaware, both in the US and the UK, of what these abortion providers actually do and what they advocate for and how they treat their patients. And so for that reason, there hasn't been too much movement on public perception of these organizations yet.
I think you're so right that this issue is such an emotional issue. And would you say that that is kind of the most prevalent argument that the pro-aborts will use in the UK is appealing to one's emotions, or is there another argument that is most persuasive used by the pro-abortion movement?
I think so, because whenever I do a television interview, I will pretty much always get asked, what about, this 9-year-old girl who's the victim of rape by her father and that sort of thing, which obviously, those cases do happen. They are exceptionally tragic, and the pro-life movement needs a compelling answer for them. I'm not dismissing them, but just because they're rare. Um, but on the other hand, normally when I go on television, I'm not talking about should we ban all these abortions. I've been on TV cases where the whole point of the debate was to say, should we lower the abortion limit from 24 weeks to 22 weeks? And it really is a tiny difference that really just affects that number of babies that are viable and they're still aborted, they're perfectly healthy, any exceptions for rape or disability or things might stay in place. And so, this question of banning abortion in these extremely tragic cases is not even relevant to the sort of topic of the discussion. And yet, every single time without question, it will be brought up. And I think the clear purpose of that is not to have a good faith discussion about, okay, let's talk about the 99% of abortions that are not in these tragic cases. And then maybe let's talk a little bit about those exceptional cases where it's relevant. It's more like, okay, you've had some good answers to our first question. So we really just need to poison the well and make everyone think you're inhumane by bringing up this extremely emotional case and giving you 20 seconds to respond. I think, I'm fine if people come in a Q&A section of a talk that I've given and we have time to discuss it and I can speak for at least a few minutes about these cases because they need answers and they're well worth answering. But I think if you're on television and it's not the topic, and they give you 20 seconds to try and sort of tease out the details and a genuine, convincing response to these horrendous situations, I think it's pretty clear that they're not trying to get an answer. They're trying to stir people's emotions. And And the reason they're doing that is because it works, because most people do just think about their emotions on this and react in that way. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I think those emotional sort of examples and rhetoric do form the majority of conversation in this country.
Yeah, that's a really helpful answer. And just as we conclude here, I just have two final questions for you. The first is, what would you like to see changed in the US and in the UK as far as pro-life laws?
It's a great question. I think, to be honest, the big kind of elephant in the room in a sense at the moment in the US is the abortion pill. And I know everyone's talking about that and it's a huge thing, but it really does offer a really significant issue of enforcement. If we do want to save these babies, and if it's easy to just kill the baby by getting a pill shipped in the mail from India and taking it at home, um, it's really difficult to see a path forward unless we have a convincing approach to that, to that drug trafficking and so on. So I think that has to be a significant focus in both countries. Of course, at the same time, we're very in very different places when it comes to the federal structure, but also to the public opinion on abortion. But both countries, we're sort of fighting a pretty tricky battle at the moment on the basic issue itself. Are you pro-life or pro-choice? And so what I would really like to see in both countries, and I think could make a difference, is to reclaim the choice narrative, to point out that maybe 1 in 4 abortions are forced on a woman against her will. So to, I guess, raise awareness on this, but combine it with policies that turn those facts into a reality or that acknowledge those facts. So, for example, in those states where abortion is still legal, or in the UK where abortion is legal, finding ways to make sure that abortion clinics do not simply remain havens and sort of facilitators for sex trafficking, for domestic abuse, and those sorts of things, which they very much are at the moment. And so I know that there are efforts being made. I'm not sort of ignoring or criticizing those efforts, but I would love to see more of that. Just a shift in that direction to just show the public that yes, for some women this might be their choice that's fully informed and under no pressure. I think that's a minority, but it might be the case for some. But I think we really need to show the public that for the majority, this is something that is really seriously a vehicle for these kinds of horrendous human rights abuses and domestic abuse, and even just the pressure from employers and from society generally. I'd love to see more done at the policy level to acknowledge and help to raise awareness of those facts.
Wow, that's a great answer. Thank you so much. And my final question for you is, do you have any message of warning or a message of encouragement to the US as far as abortion policy goes from your perspective as a doctor in the UK?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say a couple of things. One is to absolutely hold on to the the First Amendment at all costs. That's fairly self-explanatory, I think. The second would be looking at the abortion pill. We've already discussed that, and I think looking ahead, it will be 90% of abortions in the US in the future, if it's not already. It goes that way in pretty much every country, and I think to ignore the abortion pill, I think is going to leave you with a situation that basically is an abortion free for all. Um, I think it's important to grapple with the medical exceptions. Um, the opposition obviously has had a field day since Roe v. Wade was overturned, with scaremongering women about miscarriages not being legal and that sort of thing, or it being illegal to treat ectopic pregnancies. And of course, the pro-life side has fought back and tried to show that this is all just total disinformation. But I really think that ultimately what's needed is some clear clinical guidance on those questions, to make clear that removing the child if a woman's life is at risk is legal. And I suppose to think creatively about how to do that, because I guess what we've seen is it's not enough to have the fact on your side. And it's not enough just for pro-lifers to know those facts through pro-life media and those sorts of things. It really needs to be widely known. And that's not easy to do when the mainstream media wants to present a false narrative. But I think it's really important that, in schools, for example, young people for whom it's age appropriate are taught what the law actually says, that if a woman's life is at risk, it's legal to treat her. I think healthcare professionals need to be taught this. And so I think sort of state boards of education and healthcare have a really significant role to play in that. Um, and so, yeah, I think those are some of the issues where we've seen in the UK, things have gone in a really, really bad direction, and where I think the US can learn a lot. And then I think, as I sort of hinted at the start, it's not so much a warning, but an encouragement that although Europe might be further along the path to abortion than the US, there are 120 countries around the world that are currently behind the path, behind the US on that path, and desperately need support and encouragement and equipping and resourcing to be able not to make the same mistake. So I guess all I'm saying is, in the same way that Europe can help to warn America and prevent things from happening in America, and we're trying our best to help in the US, I think all of us can also help those other 120 countries to make sure that they stay pro-life, because the pressure on them is huge from the UN, from the World Bank, from parts of the US government. The social media is huge. And so I guess my closing thought would be that um, the pro-life movement, I think, will only succeed in any country if we can succeed globally. I think if it's only the US that's standing for life in 10 or 15 years, then I think it's unsustainable. It's not going to last. So ultimately, what I'd love to see is greater international networking and collaboration, because I think so much can be achieved and benefit all of us once we begin to engage on that international level. So, yeah, I'm very happy to connect with people, to work with them, to think about how to do that strategically. If you have missions groups from your church or you have a connection to another country, I just encourage listeners to think about how they could move that in a pro-life direction as well, because the number one thing we hear in these countries or about these countries is, oh, they're pro-life, we don't need to worry. The reality is that in every country we need to worry, because this is really sort of hurtling down the path very quickly. And so for anyone who has a connection with another country, whether they have friends or relatives or mission partners or any connection, I would say think about how you could turn that towards a pro-life preparation for those countries. And we'd be very, very happy to work with anyone who wants to do that as well.
Well, thank you so much for that closing thought. Thank you for that charge and that piece of encouragement to the pro-life movement. And thank you just so much for joining our podcast today. This episode has been so informative and so eye-opening, and I think it's just going to be such a helpful resource for our listeners to get a perspective on international abortion. So, Dr. Miller, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Exposed Abortion in America. Our mission is to give you, our listeners, the truth when it comes to exposing the abortion industry. Tune in next week to hear more about the secrets, horrors, and history of Planned Parenthood.